On the night of November 7, 1954, lighthousekeeper James MacLeod disappeared from his post at Cape Breton's North Point Lighthouse during the worst storm in Nova Scotia's recorded history. His body was never found. The lighthouse was automated 6 months later. The position was permanently closed. But 70 years later, fishermen along the coast still report seeing his lantern signals on stormy nights. And those who heed his warnings survive. Those who ignore them don't come back. This is the story of the lighthousekeeper who refused to abandon his duty, even in death. The guardian of Nova Scotia's most dangerous waters. The ghost who saves lives. Welcome to Cold North Files. Nova Scotia has always had a complicated relationship with the sea. It gives life and takes it away in equal measure. The fishing industry built this province, but the Atlantic Ocean has claimed thousands of lives along its rocky shores. Nowhere is this relationship more dangerous than at North Point, Cape Breton Island. North Point sits at the northernmost tip of Cape Breton, where the Gulf of St. Lawrence meets the Atlantic Ocean. It's one of the most treacherous maritime locations in all of Canada. Unpredictable currents, hidden rocks, sudden fog banks, and storms that appear without warning. Between 1850 and 1950, over 200 ships were lost in the waters surrounding North Point. That's more than 2 vessels every year for a century. The North Point Lighthouse was built in 1875 in response to this staggering loss of life. It was a necessary but brutal posting. Lighthouse keepers stationed there faced isolation, harsh weather, and the psychological toll of knowing that their vigilance was all that stood between sailors and death. James MacLeod became the keeper of North Point Lighthouse in 1947. He was 42 years old, a veteran of World War II, and a lifelong resident of Cape Breton. His grandfather had been a lighthouse keeper. His father had been a fisherman. The sea was in his blood. James took the position seriously. Perhaps too seriously, some would later say. He lived alone in the keeper's cottage attached to the lighthouse, a small 2-room structure that provided basic shelter but little comfort. His wife Margaret and their 2 children, Anne and Robert, lived in the nearby village of Dingwall, about 8 kilometers away. James would visit them every Sunday, his 1 day off each week. The rest of the time, he was alone with the light. His responsibilities were straightforward but demanding. Keep the light burning from sunset to sunrise. Monitor weather conditions. Maintain the lens and mechanisms. Record all ship traffic in the logbook. Respond to distress signals. But James went beyond his duties. He studied weather patterns obsessively. He memorized the schedule of every fishing boat in the area. He created a detailed map of every rock, shoal, and dangerous current within 10 kilometers of the lighthouse. Other keepers thought he was paranoid. Margaret worried he was becoming obsessed. But James had a simple philosophy that he repeated often. Every light I fail to keep burning is a life I fail to save. On November 7, 1954, the worst storm in Nova Scotia's recorded history began forming off the coast. Today, we'd call it a nor'easter of historic proportions. Wind speeds exceeded 150 kilometers per hour. Waves reached heights of over 15 meters. The atmospheric pressure dropped so low that instruments couldn't accurately measure it. The storm struck without adequate warning. In 1954, weather forecasting was primitive compared to today. There were no satellites, no advanced radar, no computer models. By the time officials realized how severe the storm would be, it was already too late. Fishing boats that had gone out that morning were caught at sea. Coastal communities were cut off. And North Point Lighthouse stood directly in the storm's path. James MacLeod's last radio transmission was logged at 6:47 in the evening on November 7th. He reported to the Coast Guard that the storm was intensifying beyond anything he'd ever experienced. Wind had already broken several windows in the keeper's cottage. The light mechanism was straining under the force of the wind, but it was still operational. He ended the transmission with words that would become legendary among Nova Scotia maritime workers. "The light stays on. As long as I'm breathing, the light stays on." That was the last anyone heard from James MacLeod. The storm raged for 18 hours. By the time it passed on November 8th, 43 people were confirmed dead across Nova Scotia. 22 fishing boats were lost. Entire coastal communities were devastated. And when rescue workers finally reached North Point Lighthouse on November 9th, they found something that still defies explanation. The lighthouse was intact. Battered, yes, but structurally sound. The light was still burning, still rotating, still sending its warning beam across the water. But James MacLeod was gone. The keeper's cottage had been partially destroyed. The roof was torn off, one wall had collapsed, and everything inside was soaked and scattered by wind and rain. James's personal belongings were strewn across the rocks. His logbook was found wedged between stones 200 meters from the lighthouse. But there was no body, no blood, no signs of injury or struggle. The door to the lighthouse itself was locked from the inside. The key was still in the lock. The light mechanism showed no signs of damage and was functioning perfectly. The last entry in James's logbook, written at 11:30 at night on November 7th, read simply, "Light remains steady. 3 boats visible seeking shelter. Winds exceeding any previous measurement. I will not abandon my post." Search teams combed the area for weeks. Divers explored the waters around the point. Volunteers searched the rocky coastline for miles in both directions. James MacLeod had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The official conclusion was straightforward. James had been swept into the sea by the storm, likely while trying to secure equipment outside the lighthouse. His body was carried away by the waves and lost to the Atlantic. It was a tragedy, but not an unusual one. The sea claims lighthouse keepers with grim regularity. The lighthouse was automated in May 1955. No replacement keeper was ever assigned. North Point Lighthouse became just another automated beacon, requiring only occasional maintenance visits. And that should have been the end of the story. But then the sightings began. The first reported incident occurred on March 14, 1956, just 4 months after James's disappearance. A fishing boat captain named Douglas Campbell was returning to port near dusk when fog rolled in with unusual speed. Within minutes, visibility dropped to almost zero. This was dangerous. Douglas knew he was somewhere near North Point, but in the fog, he couldn't determine his exact position. Then he saw the light. Not the lighthouse beam. Something else. A handheld lantern, swinging back and forth in a deliberate pattern. 3 long swings, 3 short swings, 3 long. The international distress signal. But the signal wasn't calling for help. It was giving a warning. Douglas immediately changed course, steering away from the swinging lantern. Minutes later, his boat passed within meters of a cluster of rocks that would have torn his hull apart. Rocks that shouldn't have been in that position according to his charts, but there they were. When the fog cleared, Douglas looked back toward North Point Lighthouse. The automated light was rotating normally. But there, on the rocks near the lighthouse, he saw a figure. A man in a lighthouse keeper's coat, holding a lantern. The figure raised one hand in acknowledgement, then turned and walked toward the lighthouse. Douglas radioed the Coast Guard to report what he'd seen. They told him no one was stationed at the lighthouse anymore. It had been automated. There was no keeper. But Douglas knew what he'd seen. And he knew that whoever that man was, he'd just saved Douglas's life. Over the next few years, more reports came in. Always the same pattern. Always during dangerous conditions. Fog, storms, equipment failures, navigational errors. A captain would see the lantern signal. The signal would warn them away from danger. And sometimes, if conditions allowed, they'd catch a glimpse of the man holding it. Always the same description. Middle-aged, weathered face, lighthouse keeper's coat, determined expression. By 1960, local fishermen had a name for him. The Guardian of North Point. Some called him the Phantom Keeper, but most simply called him by his real name, James MacLeod, spoken with the respect due to a man who'd never stopped doing his job. Margaret MacLeod, James's widow, heard the stories. At first, she dismissed them as maritime superstition. Fishermen telling tales, seeing what they wanted to see in fog and darkness. But then, in 1963, her son Robert decided to become a fisherman. Robert was 26 years old, newly married, and taking over a fishing boat from his father-in-law. On his first solo voyage, he headed out despite warnings from more experienced captains that a storm was approaching. Robert was confident. Maybe too confident. He pushed farther from shore than he should have, and when the storm hit earlier than predicted, he found himself in serious trouble. His radio failed. His compass spun uselessly. In the driving rain and massive waves, he completely lost his bearings. He was somewhere near North Point, but he couldn't see the lighthouse beam through the storm. Then, through the rain, he saw a light. Not the rotating lighthouse beam, but a steady handheld lantern, swinging in a clear pattern. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. And above the howl of the wind and crash of the waves, Robert heard a voice. His father's voice, as clear as if James MacLeod was standing right beside him. "Turn to port, Robert. 30 degrees. Trust me, son." Robert didn't hesitate. He turned the wheel hard to port, exactly 30 degrees, and pushed his throttle to maximum. His boat passed within meters of a submerged rock formation that would have sunk him instantly. He made it back to port, shaken but alive. When he told his mother what had happened, Margaret finally accepted what so many others already believed. James hadn't left. He couldn't leave. Not while ships still needed him. Not while there were still lives to save. The sightings continued through the decades. The patterns remained consistent. The lantern, the warning signals, the figure on the rocks, and occasionally, that voice, giving directions in the midst of danger. Not everyone who saw the signals survived, but the statistics told a compelling story. Between 1955 and 1975, before modern navigation technology became standard, the waters around North Point saw a dramatic decrease in maritime accidents. In the 20 years before James's death, an average of 6 boats per year were lost in that area. In the 20 years after his death, that number dropped to less than 1 per year. Coincidence? Better navigation training? Or the protective presence of a keeper who refused to abandon his duty? In 1982, the Canadian Coast Guard commissioned a study of maritime safety around North Point. The study's conclusion was diplomatically worded but clear. Ships that reported seeing unusual light signals in the area had a measurably higher survival rate during dangerous conditions than those that didn't. The researchers suggested that experienced captains might be more attuned to environmental cues and more likely to take precautions. But they couldn't explain why so many captains independently reported seeing the exact same phenomenon. The handheld lantern, the warning signals, the figure on the rocks. One researcher, Dr. Ellen Morrison from Dalhousie University, wrote in her private notes something she couldn't include in the official report. They were witnessing a mass shared delusion spanning 3 decades and hundreds of independent witnesses, or something genuinely inexplicable is protecting ships in these waters. Based on the consistency of the reports and the measurable decrease in casualties, I'm inclined toward the latter explanation, regardless of how scientifically uncomfortable that makes me. Margaret MacLeod passed away in 1989 at the age of 79. Before her death, she gave an interview to a local historian working on a book about Cape Breton lighthouses. In that interview, she said something that has become famous among those who study the North Point phenomenon. James made a promise the day he took that position. He said he'd keep that light burning and those waters safe as long as he had strength in his body. I think when the storm took him, it didn't break his promise. It just changed the way he keeps it. He's still there. He'll always be there. That's who James was. That's who he is. The modern era brought new technology to maritime navigation. GPS, radar, satellite weather forecasting, automated warning systems. Ships became safer, accidents became rarer, and the old ways of navigation began to fade into history. But the sightings at North Point didn't stop. In 2003, a cargo ship's navigation system failed during a winter storm. The captain, a veteran sailor from Greece named Andreas Konstantinos who knew nothing of the North Point legends, reported seeing a man with a lantern on the rocks, signaling them away from danger. In 2011, a yacht caught in sudden fog reported seeing the same warning signals that Douglas Campbell had described 55 years earlier. In 2018, a fishing boat with engine trouble drifted dangerously close to the rocks. The crew reported seeing a figure in old-fashioned clothing watching them from the lighthouse, and they all felt an inexplicable compulsion to drop anchor. Minutes later, the tide shifted and pushed them safely away from the rocks. And in 2019, something happened that brought the legend of James MacLeod back into the spotlight. A documentary crew came to Nova Scotia to film a series about maritime mysteries. They spent 3 days at North Point, interviewing local fishermen and investigating the lighthousekeeper legend. On their final night, they set up cameras around the lighthouse and waited. At 11:47 at night, thick fog rolled in from the sea, and their cameras captured something extraordinary. The footage shows the automated lighthouse beam rotating normally. But then, clearly visible in the fog, a second light source appears. A handheld lantern, moving in a deliberate pattern along the rocks. The lantern swings in the classic distress signal pattern: 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. The documentary crew rushed outside to investigate. They found nothing. No person, no lantern, no explanation. But when they reviewed their footage, the light was clearly there. Multiple cameras from multiple angles all captured the same phenomenon. And just before the footage ends, for a fraction of a second, a figure is visible behind the lantern. Too brief to make out details, but unmistakably human in shape. The footage was analyzed by video experts. No evidence of tampering was found. No explanation could be offered. The documentary, titled Guardians of the Coast, aired in 2020 and has been viewed millions of times online. It reignited interest in the James MacLeod story and brought new attention to the phenomenon at North Point. So what's really happening at North Point Lighthouse? Theory 1. Collective delusion and maritime folklore. Skeptics argue that the sightings are a combination of maritime superstition, suggestion, and misidentification of natural phenomena. Fishermen who know the story see what they expect to see in fog and darkness. Lights from boats, reflections, even bioluminescence in the water could be misinterpreted as lantern signals. This theory explains why the sightings are so consistent. People are primed to see a specific thing, so that's what their brains construct from ambiguous visual information. But it doesn't explain the documentary footage, the measurable decrease in accidents, or the reports from people who knew nothing of the legend beforehand. Theory 2. Residual energy and psychic imprinting. Some paranormal researchers suggest that James MacLeod's intense dedication and his violent death during the storm created what they call a residual haunting. His actions and emotions were so powerful that they imprinted on the location itself. According to this theory, what people see isn't James's conscious ghost but rather an echo of his actions, replaying under similar conditions. Like a recording that plays when the right environmental triggers are present. This would explain the consistency of the sightings and why they primarily occur during dangerous weather conditions similar to the night James disappeared. Theory 3. Intelligent haunting and active protection. Other researchers believe James MacLeod's spirit is genuinely present and actively protecting ships. They point to the fact that the warnings are responsive and appropriate to specific dangers, not just random replays of past actions. The voice that Robert MacLeod heard giving specific navigation instructions. The timing of the lantern signals that perfectly correspond to hidden dangers. The figure that appears to watch and acknowledge rescued crews. These suggest consciousness, intention, and genuine interaction rather than a simple residual echo. Theory 4. Natural phenomena misunderstood. A few scientists have suggested that the area around North Point might have unusual electromagnetic properties that could create visual phenomena resembling lights or figures. Combined with atmospheric conditions and the power of suggestion, this could explain the sightings. Some researchers have noted that the area has high concentrations of certain minerals in the rocks that could, theoretically, produce unusual effects under specific conditions. But no one has been able to demonstrate this experimentally or explain how it would create such consistent and specific imagery. Theory 5. Something we don't yet understand. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we simply don't know. The North Point phenomenon might represent something that exists at the intersection of human consciousness, strong emotion, dedication to duty, and the mysterious connection between people and places. Maybe James MacLeod's promise was so powerful, his sense of duty so absolute, that something beyond our current understanding allows him to keep it. Not as a ghost in the traditional sense, but as something else. A guardian, a protector, a keeper of promises. Here's what we know for certain. James MacLeod disappeared on November 7, 1954, during the worst storm in Nova Scotia history. His body was never recovered. Since 1956, hundreds of people have reported seeing lantern signals and a figure matching James's description near North Point Lighthouse during dangerous maritime conditions. Ships that report seeing these signals have a measurably higher survival rate than those that don't. The phenomenon has been documented on video and witnessed by people with no prior knowledge of the legend. And 70 years after his disappearance, the sightings continue. North Point Lighthouse still stands today. It's automated, remotely monitored, and requires only occasional maintenance. It's not open to the public, but you can see it from the road, standing stark and white against the gray Nova Scotia sky. Local fishermen still watch for the signals. And when they see them, they listen. Because in 70 years, no one who has heeded James MacLeod's warnings has been lost at sea. Margaret MacLeod left something behind when she died. A letter, to be opened on the 70th anniversary of James's disappearance. That anniversary was November 7, 2024, just a few months ago. The letter was brief. To whoever reads this, James always said a promise made is a debt unpaid. He promised to keep that light burning and those waters safe. I think he's still paying that debt. If you see him out there, if you see his light, don't be afraid. He's not haunting that place. He's protecting it. He's protecting you. That's what he does. That's what he'll always do. Thank you, James, for never leaving. Thank you for keeping your promise. Some duties transcend death. Some promises are too powerful to break. Some people are so dedicated to their purpose that even the grave can't stop them from fulfilling it. James MacLeod was one of those people. On stormy nights along the Nova Scotia coast, fishermen still look toward North Point. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the wind howls and the sea rises up in fury, they see it. A light in the darkness. A lantern swinging in the pattern of safety. And a figure on the rocks, watching over the waters he swore to protect. The lighthousekeeper who never left his post. The guardian who refuses to rest. The ghost who saves lives. This is Cold North Files. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. We've got more mysteries from across Canada that deserve to be told. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain while traveling Canada's coasts? Share your story in the comments below.